Part C of the first part of this whole manuscript. Okay, and hush, you troublemakers, they whispered indignantly when certain voices within their newly assimilating movements tried to alert people to what the light, quote, the light at the end of the tunnel, unquote, might actually mean, or actually did mean. Instilled within the prevailing, read privileged and best funded, leadership's minds, to the credit of the system, were the beliefs and doctrines that served the tyrannical, the established mindset, the very forces that allowed them the sweet fruits of a significant end to their particular form of injustice and repression. Such troublemakers who challenged the prevailing leadership of the newly assimilating communities included these people who stray from the appropriate understandings for diverse reasons and always kept misunderstood, and had to be kept powerless, or at least powerless feeling, and not allowed to connect with other strayed fellows too deeply lest they create more trouble. Make sure they, quote, know their place, unquote, via the use of whatever marginalizing label that can stick. And if that doesn't work, tame them in some way. So we need this new revolution in the art of democracy, the manufacture of consent. The media, the schools, nuclearized parents, the popular culture have to instill the proper beliefs. The marginalized may be allowed to spectate and once in a while voice their naive or silly or deranged opinions, or even pathological opinions, right? So-called pathological. But most of the time, they've got to be atomized, segregated, and alone. They're not supposed to organize because they might be something beyond the minority aloof. One or two crazed tunnel goers from our ranks can be tolerated to go off in another obviously deranged direction, and maybe a few others in reaction may limply question, but that's what happens when you have a democracy. Certain people don't know how to act when they're given a little freedom. It's sad, you know? So you make sure they're quite isolated. If they could be something beyond the adolescent rebel phase, quote unquote, or isolated weirdos, they might actually become meaningful participation. They might actually become meaningful participants if many of them with limited resources could get together to enter the political arena. That would be really threatening. A major response was taken on the part of the rightful masters to ensure that this kind of thing wouldn't happen to the people I mentioned earlier who must be barred from equal standing with their fellow Americans. That is, anything truly authentic or deep-reaching that might last in order to build threatening bonds, like bonds that might sustain the wrong consciousness or grow into alliances with the other troublemakers, quote-unquote, and, quote, get the ball rolling, unquote, towards meaningful democracy and liberation. That major response has worked pretty well. Although the number of independent thinking ideals increased during the multifaceted 1960s movements, by the 1980s, the range and influence of these ideals began to steadily drop. It wasn't by accident. We're now talking about this new reincarnation from the days of Dr. Kellogg. They're spending lots and lots of money, attention, and thought into how to deal with the bad social problems of the day, as they've decided them to be. They've got a whole public relations industry and many other tiers, like various professional guilds, police guilds, for example, all which have interests, a certain interesting interest in preserving their continued business, no matter the social cost in real terms. Such business can have a tough time if too many of their gimmicks get exposed, so they have to work like chess players and outmaneuver the bad guys. At the height of these freedom deviations, the established mindset set to work to find a way to counter them. Obviously, they tried to counter other movements too, but were most successful with those that were weakest and thus far unable to catch on to what was really going on. Save the children! The biggest scare in this era has revolved around that still seemingly limitless resource of people's ignorance and fear, sexuality, especially when the sexuality of young people was involved. In the mid-1970s, the reincarnations of Dr. Kellogg latched onto a new series of maneuvers that would further weaken a lot of what the late 1960s and early 1970s had wreaked so-called way too much of. Independent thought. This was quite successful. They came from the old, quote, tried and true, unquote, method of fear of sex and laced it with a bit of revamped homophobia, which would serve its purpose in two helpful ways. Divide the potential of the newly progressing gay and lesbian movement, as well as, to a certain extent, the feminist and racial civil rights movements, and isolate the unwanted people so that they might return to their states of confusion, feelings of powerlessness, and give away their newfound powers to imposed authority. The strategy was to approach the whole matter through the more subtle and effective means of propaganda, to turn the public against the inappropriate, so-called inappropriate beliefs that some of these people held, like the one that says kids aren't arbitrarily incompetent and irrational compared to adults, or the one that claims that the young people could form fully authentic but so-called non-traditional bonds with other people they liked and wanted to know more closely. Now, I want to make an editorial note here, non-traditional only in the modern sense, i.e. in the context of the nuclearized family. Historically, however, before families were so reduced, extended families, including close non-biological friends, were the norm, with much more autonomous bonding angles, rather than rigid rules imposed from outside with always the continual threat of taking the kids away if not so-called appropriate, etc. So the public had to be turned against these inappropriate beliefs, presenting them as harmful to the quote-unquote common interests. The common interests are those of us who wish to finally go towards the light at the end of the tunnel, and the helpful professionals, the newly progressing feminists, and the gay and lesbian consenting adults. That's all us. We want to be together and have things like harmony and family values and working together. Then there's those suspicious adults who like being around the kiddies in the wrong way. Those child molesters out there who, quote, won't stop forcing themselves, unquote, upon the, quote, weak and immature, unquote. One of the first directives included hysteria promotion against chicken hawks, a street slang term taken out of context and never demystified, who were making chickens, also known as kids, pose in front of their cameras so that they could record their quote-unquote abuse. This breaks up all those hopes that we had for a, quote, a continuing harmony, unquote, and, quote, the seeking of peace, unquote, that elites and commoners supposedly share. So we've got to stop them so that we can all live together and protect our children. The professionals and the concerned mothers all have the same interests, we're told. We can work together and work for family values and harmony, liking and trusting each other. But we have to make sure that these, quote, kiddie pornographers, unquote, don't come in and wreck what we've got going. That was the message, essentially. A huge amount of effort was put into presenting it. Let's see. To give a background example of that, if you read media articles of the day, 1973 to 1980, or and then continuing, and then there was Walter Mondale's congressional bill bringing in millions of dollars in funding for those interests that were in line with the status quo, keeping the sexual minorities and other groups such as young people who wanted to have sexual youth liberation and general liberation, and that means everything really. So anyway, this is, after all, the business community in general, so they control the media and have massive resources. And it has worked very effectively. Some people who are now catching on in part call it the, quote, child abuse hysteria, unquote, and are trying to say how it has gotten out of hand and that some of our hard work for rights are beginning to be victimized as a result of it. Canada's new law banning all positive images and textual accounts of or arguments of even legal sexual acts is a case in point. And that's footnote number 7. Looks like I need to stop once again. I guess I'll continue a little longer. It's vital to realize that such hysterias have been promoted over and over again to keep people on the proper track. Such ruses have worked very effectively by mobilizing community opinion in favor of vapid, empty concepts like family values. Who can be against that? Or harmony? Who can be against that? Or, as in the child sex abuse hysteria of the day, save the children. Who can be against that? In fact, what does it mean if somebody asks you, do you want to save the people in Iowa? Can you say, yes, I want to save them, or no, I don't want to save them? It's not even a question. It doesn't mean anything. The point of public relations slogans like save the children is that they don't mean anything. They mean as much as whether you want to save the people in Iowa. Of course, there was an issue. The issue was, do you support our policy? But you don't want people to ponder that issue. That's the whole point of good propaganda. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about.